When my father died, I remained at the forefront of our business. But instead of an inheritance, I received a betrayal. And that was just the beginning. My name is Mason, I'm 30 years old, and in the span of just a few months, I lost not only my job but also what used to be my entire family, a fracture that began the moment I made the decision to walk away from the family business. A choice that, to them, felt like betrayal but to me felt like the first breath of honesty I had taken in years. For most of my life, I had been tethered to the company my grandfather started and my father expanded, expected to carry the torch without question, without pause, and certainly without the luxury of personal ambition. Growing up, it was never presented as a question of what I wanted to do. It was assumed that I would join them, learn the ropes, prove myself, and eventually step into leadership. And for a while, I convinced myself that was enough. That proximity to legacy meant purpose, that obligation could substitute for passion. But slowly, over time, I began to realize that the business wasn't just consuming my energy, it was consuming my voice. Every idea I brought to the table was shut down under the guise of experience. Every decision I questioned was met with quiet disdain or mocking patience. And the more I tried to speak up, the more I saw how little trust they actually had in me. The final crack came when I discovered decisions were being made behind my back, money was being moved, contracts signed, all while I was kept deliberately in the dark. It wasn't just about business anymore, it was personal. They didn't see me as a partner. They saw me as a pawn. So I left. I walked out of the only career I had ever known, thinking maybe, just maybe, there would be space for healing after the dust settled. But instead of understanding, I was met with silence, with accusations, with a door that closed so hard behind me it still echoes. And just like that, I lost them all. My father, George, had been preparing me for the role of co-owner of our real estate firm for as long as I can remember, long before most people my age even knew what they wanted to do with their lives, and long before his health began to decline. I studied business because he asked me to, started working part-time in the company while I was still in college, and once I graduated, I was by his side almost every day for the next 9 years. Learning, listening, managing accounts, overseeing deals, and slowly stepping into the position that everyone, including my father, openly acknowledged I was meant to inherit. There was no secrecy about it. Within the company and within our family, it was an unspoken truth that I was his successor, the one who would carry forward his reputation, his legacy, and his values. It wasn't just a job, it was a long-term commitment that I had poured my energy, time, and trust into, because I genuinely believed that what we were building together would one day be mine to protect and grow. My father treated me like a partner, not just an employee, and even though he could be tough, I knew he respected me. That's why what happened after he passed felt like more than just a betrayal of business, it felt like a betrayal of him, too. After my father died 3 years ago, everything changed more abruptly than I was prepared for, and though the grief was still fresh and heavy, there was no time to pause as the business needed leadership. My Uncle Ray, my father's younger brother, stepped in as CEO, citing experience and a steady hand to guide the transition, and I accepted the role of CFO, believing it was a temporary step until I could eventually move into the position my father had always envisioned for me. I didn't fight it, not out of fear but out of respect for the legacy we both claimed to uphold. For the next 3 years, I poured every ounce of myself into the company, continuing the work my father had started and maintaining the standards he had held us to. I worked late, took the hardest calls, personally handled major clients, and made sure that the business didn't just survive his absence but continued to grow. I told myself I was honoring his memory, proving to the board and to my family that I was worthy of the future he had planned. And in doing so, I ignored the quiet shifts in tone, the changes in dynamics, the way decisions started being made without me again, because I believed if I worked hard enough, no one could take away what he had left me. But I was wrong. And then, without warning or even the decency of a private conversation, I was informed during a board meeting that my cousin Alex, who is 23 and fresh out of college with a degree in marketing and absolutely no experience in real estate, would be named the new partner of the company. The announcement was made casually as if it were a logical next step, with a few rehearsed lines about fresh perspectives and keeping the business in the family, but to me it landed like a punch to the chest. There had been no discussion, no warning, and certainly no acknowledgement of the 9 years I had worked beside my father or the 3 years I had kept the company afloat in his absence. I sat there stunned, listening to them praise Alex's enthusiasm and potential, while ignoring the fact that I had been building this place from the ground up long before he knew how to read a balance sheet. It was more than an insult, it was erasure. And as I looked around the room and saw the quiet nods of agreement from people who had once called me George's heir, I realized that something had shifted long ago, and I had just been too loyal to see it. I wasn't even told directly, which somehow made the betrayal sting even more. There was no meeting, no conversation, no warning, just silence, until my mom called me one evening with a hesitant voice and said she had heard something from my aunt over coffee, something she wasn't sure how to bring up. That was how I found out. Not from my uncle, not from the board, not even from an official company notice, but through a quiet, second-hand conversation between sisters that left me standing in my kitchen in disbelief, phone pressed to my ear, wondering how I could be so deeply invested in something and still so completely excluded from its future. I had given everything to that company after my father died, every ounce of grief, every late night, every missed holiday, and yet somehow I was the last to know that I was being replaced, not even as CEO, but in the symbolic legacy my father had left behind. I was the only one left from his side of the business, the only person who had been there from day one, and yet they treated me like a placeholder, like a figure to quietly push aside in favor of someone younger, someone easier to shape, someone with the right last name but none of the history. And in that moment, I realized that it wasn't just a professional insult, it was personal erasure. When I called Uncle Ray, still trying to process what I had just learned from my mother, I expected at least some sign of discomfort or awkwardness, maybe even a half-hearted attempt to justify the decision. But instead, he spoke with the same calm, rehearsed tone he always used when he wanted to shut a conversation down before it could begin. He confirmed it without hesitation, saying that yes, Alex would be stepping in as the new CEO, and then followed it with something that felt like a slap disguised as a compliment, that I should stay in my position as CFO to mentor him, to help guide him through the transition, as if training someone with no experience to take over my rightful place was somehow a gesture of trust or respect. He didn't see a problem with it. Not the betrayal, not the way I had been blindsided, not the fact that the person I was being asked to mentor had never contributed a single meaningful hour to the company my father and I had helped build. There was no regret in his voice, no acknowledgement of what this meant to me or what it erased. Just quiet confidence in a decision he had clearly made long before I was ever meant to hear about it. And as he spoke, I realized that to him, I was never really a partner. I was a placeholder. A loyal, convenient bridge between legacies. And now that the next name had arrived, my role was to step aside and make it easy. Trying to stay composed, I offered what I thought was a fair and reasonable compromise. If they were determined to make Alex CEO, then fine, let him have the title and the spotlight, but I would remain CFO and be officially named a partner in the company, a recognition of my years of work and the role I had played in keeping the business afloat after my father died. It wasn't about ego anymore, it was about fairness, about preserving even a shred of dignity and acknowledgement in the only professional life I had ever known. But Uncle Ray didn't even take a moment to consider it. He said almost casually that he couldn't commit to anything without first consulting with Alex, as if Alex, who hadn't even graduated a year ago and had never held a leadership role in his life, now had the authority to determine my future. That sentence, "I have to talk to Alex," was the final blow the moment the reality settled fully in. Not only had they excluded me from the decision, but they had also placed my fate in the hands of someone who had done nothing to earn that power, someone who had been handed everything I had worked for simply because of timing and bloodline. That was the last straw. Any illusion that this was still my company, that I still had a place in the legacy my father built, shattered in that instant. And I knew then that staying would only mean diminishing myself every single day to protect someone else's illusion of leadership. So I made the decision to walk away. That evening, still reeling from the conversation with Uncle Ray and the quiet finality of everything it confirmed, I sat alone in my apartment with my phone in my hand, staring at the contact I hadn't touched in over 15 years. Uncle Scott, my father's youngest brother, the one the family had all but erased after he broke away to start his own company and became what they called the outsider, or more bluntly, the traitor. Growing up, I had heard his name only in whispers, wrapped in bitterness and caution, like speaking it too freely might summon the weight of the family feud that had pushed him out in the first place. But that night, something shifted in me. I realized that the same people who had once turned on him had now turned on me, and if there was anyone who might understand what it felt like to be cast aside by your own blood, it was him. I didn't even think. I just typed the message, a simple, honest note that said I hoped he was well, that I had some things I needed to talk about, and that I wasn't sure who else would really understand. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, and for the first time since this entire mess began, I felt like maybe I had taken the first step not just away from what I had lost, but towards something new. Scott responded almost immediately, and his message was warm, direct, and without any of the hesitation I had come to expect from the people I once trusted. He told me he'd heard about what had happened through old colleagues and that, to be honest, he wasn't surprised. Then, without ceremony or delay, he offered me a position at his company, as CFO, with a clear path toward becoming CEO once he retired. But what truly stunned me wasn't just the offer of a future, it was the respect that came with it. He said I could come on board as a partner from day one, that he didn't need years of waiting or politics to know what I was worth. There was no posturing, no patronizing tone, no need to consult anyone else, just a straightforward invitation that recognized not only my experience, but the loyalty I had shown to a family that ultimately turned its back on me. In the span of one conversation, he gave me more trust than my own uncle had in years. And as I sat there reading his words, I realized I didn't just feel grateful, I felt seen. For the first time since my father's death, I felt like someone actually believed in me, not because of legacy, but because of who I had proven myself to be. 2 days later, I walked into the office I had once treated like a second home and submitted my official resignation from Ray's company, leaving behind not just a job but a chapter of my life that had shaped me and, in the end, broken something in me I hadn't realized was fragile. Ray didn't even try to stop me. He barely looked up from his desk as I handed him the letter, and all he said, without emotion, without acknowledgement of everything I had given, was, "You've already been replaced." It was cold, efficient, and clearly rehearsed, like he'd been waiting for the moment to say it, to prove that I was as disposable as I'd feared. There was no thank you, no goodbye, not even a trace of the respect I had once believed still existed between us. I walked out without a backward glance, not because it didn't hurt, but because I knew there was nothing left to salvage. And later that afternoon, I drove across town and walked into Scott's office, smaller, humbler, but alive with energy, and met the team I would be joining. They welcomed me not with suspicion or forced smiles, but with genuine curiosity and warmth, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was stepping into a room where I didn't have to prove I belonged. I just did. We took a photo together after my first full day, Scott, myself, and a few members of the leadership team, standing in front of the company's logo with genuine smiles that, for once, didn't feel forced or performative, and someone suggested posting it on social media to mark the occasion. I hesitated for a moment, knowing what kind of response it might provoke, but deep down I was tired of hiding, tired of shrinking myself to protect the egos of people who had already discarded me. So we posted it, a simple photo with a caption about new beginnings and building the future. The reaction from my family was instantaneous. Within hours, I started receiving angry messages, flooded with accusations of betrayal and selfishness, as if I had somehow turned my back on them by choosing to stand where I was actually respected. My aunt sent a long, venomous email, my cousin Alex blocked me entirely, and Ray's message, short and bitter, ended with a thinly veiled threat about burning bridges you can't rebuild. It didn't take long before I was completely shut out. No more calls, no more texts, just silence soaked in resentment. They didn't see my years of dedication, my loyalty, or even the quiet patience I had clung to until the end. All they saw was disobedience. And in choosing to start over, I became a traitor in their eyes. But as painful as that isolation was, it also felt like the first honest step I had taken in years. Because this time, I wasn't sacrificing myself to keep anyone else comfortable. What struck me the most, more than Ray's coldness or the vitriol from extended family, was my mom's reaction, because just days before she had been radically supportive, encouraging me to stand up for myself, telling me she was proud of me for refusing to be treated like a placeholder, and even agreeing that the way I'd been sidelined was unfair and disrespectful. She had been my one steady voice through the storm, the person I believed would always stay in my corner, no matter how messy the situation became. But after the photo with Scott went public and the family began to erupt, something in her changed. She didn't yell or accuse me like the others did, but when I called her, her voice was flat, distant in a way that didn't even sound like her. She said, simply and quietly, that I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross, that joining forces with Scott, after everything that had happened between him and the rest of the family, was something she couldn't support. I tried to remind her of what she had said, of everything I had gone through, but it didn't matter. She just said she needed time and then she hung up. She hasn't spoken to me since. And that silence, more than any message, has been the hardest part to accept, because losing my job was painful, losing my future in the company was devastating, but losing my mother's voice in my life feels like the deepest wound of all. I was left completely alone in terms of family, cut off from the people who had once claimed to love and support me unconditionally, but in that loneliness something unexpected began to grow. A new chance, a new foundation built not on obligation but on mutual respect. As the dust settled, I started receiving quiet messages from former colleagues at Ray's company, people who had seen what happened to me and recognized the writing on the wall. At first, it was just a few cautious conversations, but slowly, one by one, people began leaving, walking away from the legacy they no longer believed in and choosing instead to join us at Scott's firm. What began as a painful exit on my part turned into a quiet revolution. My decision sparked something, a chain reaction fueled by years of tension and unspoken resentment. And within months, the very people who had once sat across the table from me were now sitting beside me, building something stronger together. We weren't just recovering from loss, we were creating something new, something worthy. And now we've become a serious competitor to Ray's company, not just in numbers but in reputation and innovation, and in loyalty that's earned, not demanded. I may have lost the family I was born into, but in its place I found a team that sees me, believes in me and builds beside me, not because they have to but because they want to. A month after I had moved in with Scott's team and settled into my new role, we sat together late one evening after everyone else had left the office, the kind of quiet moment that only surfaces after long days and shared trust. He had been unusually reflective, almost hesitant, and I could tell there was something he had been holding onto for a long time. That's when he told me the truth, something I had never been allowed to hear growing up, something that had shaped my entire understanding of our family without me even knowing it. Years ago, long before the fallout that cast him out of both the company and the family, my mother had tried to seduce him. He was in his late 20s then, young and ambitious but already aware of the tightrope he was walking by being the youngest brother in a legacy he wasn't meant to inherit. One night, my father caught them together, not in an affair, but in a moment of blurred lines and bad judgment, with Scott pulling away and my mother spinning the narrative before he could even speak. She told my father that Scott had made the first move, that he had cornered her, and in a rage fueled by betrayal and pride, my father had thrown him out without a second thought. Scott said he never spoke up, never fought back publicly because he didn't want to destroy the family, didn't want to risk me and my siblings becoming collateral damage in a scandal none of us had created. And as I sat there absorbing it, the entire history I'd been told, of the so-called betrayal, of Scott's ambition, of his selfishness, unraveled in an instant. I realized that everything I had believed about him had been a lie built to protect someone else's image. And suddenly, her silence now, her rejection of me, her turning cold the moment I stood beside Scott, it all made sense in a way that hurt more than I was ready for. Because this wasn't just business or family politics. This was a cover-up that cost him everything and kept me blind for years. After that conversation with Scott, sitting in the quiet of that office with the weight of the truth finally laid bare, something inside me settled in a way it never had before. For the first time in this entire ordeal, I didn't feel conflicted or guilty or torn between loyalty and survival. I felt clarity. I finally understood that I had done the right thing, not just professionally but personally. I wasn't a traitor. I wasn't disloyal. I didn't abandon anyone. I simply stood up for myself in a world that had spent years telling me that my worth was conditional, that my voice only mattered if it echoed someone else's expectations. I had carried the burden of being George's son and the pressure of being molded into the image of a legacy I didn't shape, and for even longer, I had been living under the silent manipulation of a mother who had rewritten history to protect herself. But in that moment, I realized I was done being anyone else's version of who I should be. I wasn't a placeholder, I wasn't a second choice, and I wasn't built to live in someone else's shadow. I was Mason, flawed, tired, grieving, but finally undeniably real. And from that point forward, I stopped trying to reclaim what was never truly mine and started to build something of my own, piece by piece, not out of duty, not out of revenge, but out of the quiet, unwavering belief that I deserved a life that was mine.